Our speaker is Rich DeMuro. He works for Waters and has since 2008. He has over 30 years of experience working with analytical instruments, and his specialty is in liquid chromatography. Additionally, Rich has been very active with CCDG. He is one of the past presidents of CCDG, and currently he is the membership co-chair. So we're really excited to hear from him tonight. So please join me in welcoming Rich DeMuro.
And thanks for everybody for coming out tonight. I have spent many evenings at Mickey Finn's, albeit at the original facility across the street, discussing chromatography, but usually just across the table from a colleague after we got done working at AbbVie or Abbott, and shared meals and watched sports, drank beer, and talked shop. And so delighted to be here tonight and to speak to a bigger audience. The title of my talk today is Best Practices for Ultra-High Performance Liquid Chromatography and Mass Spectrometry. And I'm going to start with a history lesson. So back in the Stone Age, when there were such things as books and libraries, and Google didn't exist, the books that you see on the slide, Introduction to Modern Liquid Chromatography, by Snyder and Kirkland and later Golden, was considered a sacred text for practitioners of LC. And true story, back in, 1987, I went to the library and I picked up this book. Probably, I'm guessing, was the 1979 revision, in preparation for what I was hoping was going to be a second interview with Shimadzu for a HPLC product specialist position. At the time, I was working in a medical research lab, doing a few HPLC assays, and I was looking to advance my career, actually get a career. There's not much longevity or at least excitement in lab tech work, especially when a lot of that has to do with sacrificing animals. I went home and I studied the textbook in anticipation of a call. I did get the call, didn't need the information in the book, got the job, but even despite that, this text, I didn't understand it at the time really, but it gave me the underpinnings for the theory of HPLC and the practice of HPLC, but it wasn't until actually much later throughout my career when I realized the difference between general practice and textbook practice. Because that's really my focus here tonight. My focus here tonight is that UHPLC is really textbook liquid chromatography versus HPLC, where it's more forgiving. So that's kind of my focus tonight. So, let's define the acronyms. HPLC versus UHPLC. So, high performance liquid chromatography, it really gets down to the size of the particle in the column. Okay? For 30 plus years, 5 micron particles were the norm for HPLC, and then UHPLC back in the first commercial instrument in 2004, 1.7 micron became the standard, if you will. Okay? And the reason why is because the smaller the particle, the better the chromatographic resolution in a shorter period of time, increasing sensitivity because your peaks are narrower and taller. Okay? And those things were always known. The textbook knew that. Okay? Back in 1974, the textbook knew that. But it wasn't until the commercialization of the product to overcome some of the problems associated with pumping a non-compressible fluid into a column packed with very small particles that UHPLC became a reality. So when it comes to the LC performance, it's important to remember that it really is column and system dependent. What we try to do in the system is limit the dispersion of the bands as they move across the column and they move through the system. The more dispersed these bands are, the wider they are, the less chance we have to separate them. So, The column itself is responsible for a lot of dispersion. Okay? We can minimize that dispersion by decreasing the particle size of the column, and that's what UHPLC does. System effects, typically referred to as system dispersion or extra column volume. That is part of the flow path where the sample passes outside of the column. Okay? So things like the tubing between the injector to the column, the tubing from the column to the detector, the tubing between detectors. Quality of connections, detector self-flow volumes, etc. And it's really important to understand that system dispersion can negate the benefits of the best column in the world. So you can have a column, and maybe the insert in the column says how many theoretical plates there are with the column, but if you put it on a system that's not designed to work well with that column, you're not going to get the performance out of it. Okay? All right, so when it comes to dispersion, an HPLC is probably going to have 30 microliters or more. A UHPLC is going to have maybe 12 or less. Okay? As I mentioned earlier, the purview of HPLC is the 5 micron particle, 4.6 millimeter ID. The purview of UHPLC is 2.1 millimeter ID, 1.7 micron, 1.6 micron, 1.8 micron, something like that. Okay? The classic HPLC, the pressure limits were about 6,000 pounds per square inch. I know when I practiced HPLC, I did not really feel comfortable going above 3,000 psi. The pumps were at least spec'd at 6,000, but they weren't going to be terribly robust if you operated them above 3,000 continuously. UHPLC operating pressures are 9,000 to 18,000, and we routinely operate them at those pressures. Now, no, I'm not. If I have a pressure limit of my system of 15,000 pounds, I only really start getting skittish when the top end of my pressure envelope is about 14,000. Okay? So I'm not afraid to operate them at their limits. Okay? Okay, so just to kind of put a finer point on it, UHPLC technology is the column in the system. The system preserves the benefits provided by the small particles. Okay? And those benefits being resolution, speed, and sensitivity. Okay? UPLC is a Waters brand name, so if I were writing a peer-reviewed journal, even though I work for Waters, I would be using the generic term UHPLC for high-performance liquid chromatography. Everything that you've learned about HPLC applies to UHPLC. There are really no new rules. Everything in that textbook applies both. Okay? It's suitable for any chromatographic application. We often get asked by less experienced practitioners, hey, can I put my HPLC column on your UPLC? Well, of course you can, as long as you can plumb it, and as long as the column compartment can hold it, of course you can. There's nothing to prevent you from doing that. Okay? It's used extensively for method development. One reason why it's used for method development is because you can develop methods faster. Even if your goal is ultimately to translate that method to an HPLC, because you don't really need the horsepower of an HPLC, you can at least develop the method more quickly. Okay? But I do like to say that UHPLC is textbook liquid chromatography. It is much less forgiving of the things that you can get away with in HPLC. So the tubing ID, the length, fittings, sample diluents, the things I'm going to talk about going forward here tonight are critical to getting the performance out of the system. Okay, tubings and fittings. All right, for high pressure connections on your system, typically, you're going to be using the pre-cut steel tubing supplied by the vendor. Okay? unfortunately still have a cutting wheel, stainless steel tubing cutting wheel in my toolkit, but I probably haven't used it in 10 years. Because, number one, it's probably going to make such a poor cut that even if I swage a ferrule onto that tubing, it's going to leak. So typically you're going to be using those vendor supplied material. Okay? So from the pump to the injector, from the injector to the column, you're going to be using that. Okay? Low pressure connections, that is after the column, to the detector, you can use PEEK tubing, and that's what I use exclusively, PEEK tubing and finger-tight connections. Okay. This is the classic instructions for swaging a steel ferrule onto steel tubing. And the most important thing, of course, is to make sure that you push the tubing into the fitting until it stops before you start tightening the knot. Okay? So another thing that is pretty important too, and it was especially problematic for the first generation of acuity systems, is that the piece that connected to the column, from the injector to the column, the piece that the column, was stainless steel. It was a fitting that would get bent. The ferrule wouldn't slide freely. So that fitting, that connection was often made poorly. So it's important when you're connecting any piece of tubing, whether it's a finger tight or steel tubing, that the pieces slide freely, the nut slides freely, the ferrule slides freely. If it doesn't, throw it away. Throw that piece of tubing away again. Okay, finger tight fittings. Did I say don't use tools? Yes, don't use tools. It's unnecessary. They will hold at their rated pressure. If they don't, tell the vendor, send them back, get your money back, because they should. Over-tightening will, typically a finger-tight fitting has a PEEK ferrule, or a polymeric ferrule. Okay? Over-tightening it will compress that ferrule. Okay? Which will eventually lead to a less than ideal connection, band broadening. Okay? If it leaks, toss it, get a new one. Okay? This kind of stuff is especially problematic for systems that are shared by more than one user. Right? It's easy for me to adhere to the rules because I work for a vendor, there's only one other person in the lab, he has his gear, I have mine, and I'm the master of my own domain. Okay? Multi-user systems, this is where we typically see problems. Tubing is just grabbed from one to the other. There's maybe one or two people that are really focused on being a good LC practitioner, and others are more focused on the science of what they're doing. So it's important to make sure that someone is on the ball in any laboratory to make sure that these standards are being upheld. Okay. All right, so when it comes to swaging a ferrule or making a connection, what's really important is the depth of this piece of tubing sticking out from the end of the ferrule. For Waters, for the longest time before acuity, was the oddball of the industry. Okay? Had a much longer ferrule depth than anyone else. Okay? With acuity, that's not the case. With acuity, it's pretty much standard Parker swage rock fitting, which I'm grateful for, because I never liked that long depth, not because it didn't work, just because it was different. And it was, you could immediately tell. You walked into the lab and you saw a piece of tubing that has ferrule swage to it, you could immediately tell it was Waters. Okay? So if you do have pre-swaged tubing, and that's becoming rarer and rarer because you're using typically vendor-supplied stuff with your UHPLCs, it's important not to mix and match. Right? The theorists, the strict practice would say never use a piece of tubing that was swaged in a different fitting than the one you're using it for. In reality, you can get away with that, but you still need to be careful. You still need to know that, okay, yes, this was swaged in a water's fitting, I can use it, or it wasn't swaged in an old water's fitting. All right, so when it comes to the problem of band dispersion, this is what we are concerned about. The ferrule depth being too short, so the tubing doesn't butt all the way up to the connection, so any sample that passes through here gets diluted, swirls around, spreads out, so you get band broadening. Okay? If the ferrule depth is too long, the ferrule won't seat properly and it will leak. All right, so this is a real example that I captured this data a week or so ago. And on the left, what you have is an improper ferrule depth, where you can see where there's no tubing peeking out at the end of that ferrule. And on the right, you can see some tubing peeking out, properly made connection. All right, so this improper ferrule depth is represented by the black trace chromatogram. And the improper ferrule depth is the black trace chromatogram, and the proper ferrule depth is the blue trace chromatogram. And this is the column outlet tubing, okay? So the column outlet to the detector. So you can see just from the overlay, we've got broader, black peaks are broader. You actually see some indication that there's some that elutes a little bit later than the bulk of it for these two peaks. Okay? So that's what happens. Okay? So we also notice, what else do we notice? We notice that the height of the proper connection is taller. Okay? So that means your signal to noise ratio is going to be higher. If we take a look at some of the more quantitative look at the results, the plus indicates the proper ferrule depth, the red X indicates the improper. We see the area is higher, the height is higher, the width of the peak is narrower, and the tailing is better. Okay? So it's a more symmetrical peak. Okay? Depending on what you're doing, that may not be too inconsequential. If you're trying if you're developing a method or trying to reproduce a method from the USP or something like that, you may have to meet certain tailing criteria, and maybe that won't meet it. As I mentioned, peak tubing can be used after the column for UHPLC. The typical IDs for that kind of work is 0.004 inch internal diameter or 0.0025. Like any connection, you want to use the shortest piece possible. Don't use enough. Don't stretch it, because that's horrible when you have to stretch the tubing to make the connection. So use the shortest length, but don't go crazy. And when you cut the tubing, this is my preferred cutting tool, a little upchurch guillotine, if you will. Okay? The way to cut the tubing is not to cut through it like a guillotine would, but to score the tubing and then snap it. That'll give you a straighter cut, and it also won't seal the tubing, which might happen if you're working with 0025 tubing and you cut right through it and seal it. Again, an example from a week or so ago, where on the left I've got 0.004 inch internal diameter tubing from the outlet of the column to the inlet of the 0.01 inch tubing going from the column to the detector. The equation for the volume of a piece of tubing indicates that if you were to double the radius of the tubing, you would actually increase the volume up by a factor of 4. So this is about a factor of 6, 3.5 microliters versus 22. Okay? All right, so this is my separation. The black being the 004 internal diameter tubing, and the blue being the 0.01. So we can see, yes, much broader peak, all peaks. Okay? And if we focus on this area, which we'll do in the next slide here, and bring up the statistics for the resolution, we can see, yeah, with the 004, we're pretty much at the gold standard of resolution between two peaks for USB method 2, right? And whereas when we use the inappropriate tubing, we're nowhere near where we want to be. Okay? Sample diluents. This is probably the thing that new practitioners overlook most often. Okay? The textbooks have always said, make sure your sample diluents are no stronger than your mobile phase. Doing gradient, that would be your initial composition of mobile phase. Because this will facilitate analyte focusing at the head of the column. So we can see with this separation, where we're going from 5 to 90% acetonitrile in 3.5 minutes. We've got a 5 microliter injection. The upper chromatogram is the diluent is water. The bottom chromatogram, the diluent is acetonitrile. So what's happening here is there's breakthrough of these two peaks. I can see that because on the downstream of the UV detector here, I also have a mass detector, and I can tell that caffeine and acetaminophen, which this is acetaminophen, this is caffeine, they're both right there. So you get a breakthrough there, misshapen peak here, misshapen peak there, and that's not a terrible looking peak, and that's typically what you would see. The later eluders would be least affected by the strong sample diluent. The early eluders would be most affected. So you've got a couple choices. You can start using a weaker diluent, like 50% acetonitrile, make it 25%, see what happens. What I always do, especially for someone that needs proof that the diluent is the problem, is I always inject less. This is a series of injections where the diluent is acetonitrile. So we've got 5 microliters, 2 microliter injection. And you can see at 2 microliters, these two peaks, pretty good. Okay? At 0.5, all of them are pretty good except for the acetaminophen, and at 0.1, they all become good. So that's kind of the diagnostic I use to prove that the problem is the diluent. Detector sampling rates. UHPLCs going to generate peaks of a couple seconds wide, 3, 4, sometimes 2, okay? Versus HPLC where you're at 10, 20, 30. Okay? So it's important that we acquire enough data points to accurately characterize that peak. Okay? So I've always been a 20 points across the peak kind of guy. That's the rule I've always used forever and ever. I want 20 points across the peak. It's my strong opinion that having 20 points is even more important when your peak is only 2 or 3 seconds wide. Right? If you're 2 or 3 seconds wide at the base, what's it look like up at the apex? Half a second? Okay. So I want to make sure that I have enough points. 15 points across the peak might be fine for a 30 or 40 second wide peak. It's probably not going to, it's not going to be fine for a 2 second wide peak. Okay? So what I always do when I am trying to set my sampling rate, I make a scouting run, determine what my peak width is, and then adjust my sampling rate so that the number of points per second times the peak width is 20 points across the peak. Okay? If you don't have that, then your precision and reproducibility will suffer. Peak apex may not be captured. Peak start and stop may be difficult to determine. Okay. So this is kind of a stylized representation of what you might see with 1 point per second. Connect the dots, appearance, 2 points per second. Still connect the dots. 5, getting a little better. You see a lot of this kind of look in mass spectrometry. Okay? Sometimes, hopefully you can work around that. Hopefully you can improve that. Sometimes you can't. You're trying to do so many acquisition functions at one time that it's really difficult to do. But as we get up to 10 points and 20 points and 40 points, you can see that as we increase the number of points across the peak, the peak becomes more representative of what an analog peak would look like, right? Most mass spectrometers don't use the term sampling rate. They'll use the term scan time for scanning acquisitions, or dwell time for selected ion monitoring, or MRM acquisitions. Okay. This is equivalent to the sampling period, which is simply the inverse of the sampling rate. So just calculate the inverse of the dwell time or scan time to get the sampling rate, and then you can do the same kind of mathematics that we did on the previous slide, determine the peak width, and then do the multiplication. Okay? In MS, especially when it comes to selected ion monitoring experiments, and especially with MRM, tandem quad work, we are often doing multiple functions. Okay? So when you're doing multiple functions, a single function, you may have enough points across the peak at a given scan time. 2 functions at the same time, you would essentially cut the number of points across the peak in half. Okay? So you're better off to time schedule. So what do I mean by that? Taking this as an example, if we have an expected peak width of 4 seconds and the desired number of points across the peak at 20, and a dwell time of 0.2 seconds, which means 5 points per second, I have a single analyte. This piece of software will actually allow me to input these things and calculate the number of points across the peak forming. So with a single function, we've got 20 points across the peak. With 2 functions across the entire time scale, I only have half that number. So, if this were my MRM experiment, and my acetaminophen and my caffeine don't co-elute, and they don't, I would time schedule them. No need for me to collect data on acetaminophen when caffeine is not eluting. And that was a very real example. It was several years ago. Someone had purchased one of our tandem protocols, and I went into, and she called me. I planned to go to do some training, but she called me with a complaint. Her precision was awful. Okay. I said, okay, well, I'm coming up for some training, and I'll visit you, and I'll see what's going on. So I got there, and she had about 30 MRMs, all spanning the entire, 10, 15-minute acquisition. Okay. So I said, well, you've only got like 3 points across each peak. That's why your precision is so good. And she said, her comment was, well, they told me I could have, 30 MRMs for each acquisition. I said, well, you can, but you still have to operate within the parameters of what the instrument. There's what's possible, and there's what's beneficial analytically, right? So once we squared that away with time scheduling, things fell into place. Okay, I'm going to finish up my talk this evening on some best practices, particularly related to mass spectrometry. We're talking about contamination, because that's a big bugaboo for mass spec, some personal considerations, glassware handling, solvent and additive selection, and system hygiene. Common sources of contamination are glassware, mobile phase solvents and additives, bacteria. Hopefully we don't have that, but remarkably we still encounter it. I encountered it last week, where, and surprisingly, the laboratory admitted that they had bacteria. The gentleman, the lab manager, described it as heterotrophs, and I'm like, what's a heterotroph? He said bacteria. I said, no. You have to remediate that. So the common sources of contamination are important to eliminate because UHPLC will make a peek out of things that HPLC just kind of resulted in a blob, a little roll of the baseline that you may have ignored. Okay? One thing that, as a vendor of UHPLC products, what we've encountered, what I've encountered, is that sometimes people don't want to know what is in their sample, or get unnerved when they find out when they adopt UHPLC that there are other peaks that they didn't know that were there. Truth be told, as good as liquid chromatography is, every peak probably has a correlation rate, unless it's a manufactured product of very few inlets. Okay, why do we care about contamination? Well, if we're doing scanning acquisitions, one reason we care is noisy total line chromatograms. Common representation for scan work is total line chromatograms. If we have a lot of background contamination, or even just typical background contamination, which you're never going to eliminate completely, peaks of interest can be hiding in the noise of the TIC or hiding in the grass. So you can't really see what you're after. Another problem is in the spectrum that you acquire as part of your scan work, you have unexplained spectral peaks. So the interpretation is compromised. You have to ask yourself, do I have a coevolution? Is it a fragment ion? Is it a background ion? Is it a weird adduct? What is it? For scanning, selected ion monitoring, and MRM work, we are primarily concerned about ion suppression effects. So ionization is a competitive process. So the background contaminants or co-eluders may outcompete your analytes for charge. Okay? And if it does, your sensitivity will be suppressed, your ionization will be suppressed. Okay? Along with that, excuse me, you'll have a reduced range of linearity for your calibration curves. You have poor precision. Okay? You may have undesirable adduct formation, as I mentioned. And this is really important. It's easy when you're doing MRM work to forget that there's potentially stuff in your mobile phase that is hurting you. Okay? Just because you're not looking for it doesn't mean it's not hurting you. So it's probably, even if you're doing MRM work, it's probably a good idea, at least at the outset or periodically, to monitor full scan acquisitions from time to time to see what's going on there. Adduct formation, typically for LCMS, we are looking for either the protonated adducts, the N plus H, N plus 1 for positive ion, or N minus H, N minus 1 for negative ion. But there's all kinds of other adducts that can form. Common ones that we see a lot: sodium, potassium, ammonium, things like water, acetonitrile can even form adducts. For the negative work, maybe chloride, formate, acetate. Typically we try to avoid these. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes the alkyl preferentially prefers to form a sodium adduct. Sometimes we purposely promote one of these adducts with a mobile phase additive because maybe the N plus H doesn't form that readily, so maybe we're banking on looking at the N plus NH4 ammonia. Okay, this is an example of things hiding in the grass of a TIC. So this was some work done with a single quadrupole mass spectrometer, where the MS down at the bottom was an adjunct to UV. Okay? So this was an impurity assay where the scientists told me what the peaks of interest were. Okay? And as we can see in the TIC, only 4 of the peaks that we see in the 6 that we see in the UV are readily visible. So we can see this one, can't see that one, can kind of see that one, can see that one, can see that one, can't see that one. Okay? So that's one reason why we try to minimize contamination. This is never going to go away completely. Okay? But it's always a good idea to take a look at background signals. So take a look at what the spectrum looks like, say here, where there is no peak eluting, and get a handle on, does that seem excessive? If you're unsure, ask your vendor. Okay. So putting a finer point on that slide, so this is the tick that we saw before. This particular piece of software automatically extracts the base peak information from the mass data just by integrating the UV. So this told me that, the base peak of the MS signal here, of the MS spectrum here, is 664. So extracting 664 from the full scan data, yeah, we can see it. Definitely have a peak there. Okay. This is my go-to reference for contamination. It's about going on 12 years now. I'm hoping it gets revised and expanded. The best part of this reference really is the spreadsheet. Okay, I don't go to the reference itself. I just go to the spreadsheet where there's hundreds of reported contaminant ions. So if I see something that's excessive in some of my mass data, I'll go here. Hopefully I can identify it. Hopefully that identification I can rationalize as something that happened with the system. Is it TEA or some other analyte or mobile phase additive that was put through the system. So this is a good resource to have, and frankly I have this spreadsheet on all of my systems in the lab. Personal considerations, always wear gloves, so don't touch mobile phase, solvent suction filters, don't touch the solvent suction lines with your bare hands, and don't go out to lunch and eat greasy fried chicken, and come back to the lab without washing your hands. Be careful about personal care products like hand cream, and hair gel, and those kinds of things. A word about nitrile gloves, and I found this out quite by accident, probably about the end of last year. A solvent vendor came to our lab. They wanted to demonstrate. They wanted us to demonstrate our time of flight mass spectrometer for some testing that they were going to do with their solvents. It was Honeywell, Burdick and Jackson. Okay. So prior to the client's arrival in Wooddale, my lab in Wooddale, I worked up. She sent me the protocol. She sent me solvents, and I worked up the test and got her some data. And I said, it looks like you have detergents in your mobile phase, in your solvent, in your methanol, or acetic nitrite, specifically linear alkyl benzene sulfonates. Okay? Because in the spectra that were generated, I could observe the tell for LAS contamination. Negative ions at 297, 311, 325, 339. Okay? So I tried to convince her that, it's pretty common, I'm not surprised that they're everywhere, they're hard to get rid of. Maybe you washed the bottles before you filled them with your product. But she was pretty convinced. She convinced me that we don't have them. We know what they are, but we don't have them. So that evening I went home and I took a pretty deep dive into Google. I had to go a couple pages in. It was not the first page, it was not the second page. And it was some minor reference that I found in a probably years old post to a chromatography forum. Somebody said, hey, I see this, and the response was, oh yeah, we see that too. It's from your nitrile gloves. So then I did some more Googling on the production of nitrile rubber and learned that, surfactants are used for the production. So I should have known from the gloves I was using, because I knew forever that they got foamy when they got wet. So I should have known, but I didn't. So now I don't use those gloves anymore. Somebody told me maybe 2 weeks ago that she did some testing on various products, and she seemed to remember that the Kimberly-Clark purple gloves were pretty good ones. So that's what I use now. So yeah, and to kind of support my investigation of that, I did some infusion work, taking a simple extraction, took a little piece of glove, put it in a simulation bottle with some water, and shook it up, and then infused it. And this is the result. This is my blank, and this is my brand A glove, my brand B. You can see the LAS. So this is just zoomed from the full skin. So be careful about that. But you should still wear gloves. The story that I was in the lab doing some training, and I was harping on gloves, and then we went to the laboratory, and someone was removing the fitting from the column, and I said, "You're not wearing gloves." And she said, "Well, I'm not touching the tubing, the nut." And I said, "Okay. How would you feel if your surgeon said, oh, I didn't touch your skin, I'm just touching you." Glassware. If at all possible, it is possible. Glassware, dedicate the glassware to for both your roll phase solvents and your everything solvents. Use the good technique that you learned in your analytical chem courses in college. Rinse the bottle with whatever you're filling it with, and then fill it. Okay? I see this less and less, and it's good. When I started my career in chromatography, yeah, we all covered our mobile phase bottles with paraffin. And paraffin is wax. It's going to be degraded by probably just the vapors of acetonitrile. So, don't use it. Okay? If you don't have the bottle caps that are provided by the vendor, or that came with the mobile phase reservoir, then use aluminum foil, cover it with that just to keep the dust out. As far as solvent selection and reagent selection, use the highest purity water, solvents and reagents that you can find and that your company allows you to purchase. Okay? Yes, there are now vendors certify things as UHPLC grade, UHPLC MS grade, LCMS grade. Those are the ones that you want to use. Ensure that your water purification systems are well maintained. Some do choose to use bottled water, although if you were, my recommendation would be to do what is least cost effective, which is buy the smallest volume possible. Once you open a 4-liter bottle of water, anything in the atmosphere can get in it, bacteria can grow, it sits in the cabinet, okay? You don't really notice it. Okay. Solvent recommendations that my company makes. Historically, we haven't paid too much thought to the vendors of solvents, but with the introduction of UPLC, we did. So these are some that we have tested and vetted. In my lab, we use Fisher. Other parts of my company use the Honeywell Burke and Jackson. Of course, for LCMS, non-volatile additives are not MS friendly. So the class of phosphate buffers, which are great for UV, are fundamentally incompatible with LCMS. Okay. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, when MS started to become more common in laboratories, vendors used to advertise how wonderful their sources worked when the source chamber was all covered in white crystals. We don't do that anymore, because the reality is they may work, but you're going to be cleaning them constantly. And more and more applications that you see from vendors, even if it's a method that might benefit from, say, a phosphate buffer, more and more vendors are using MS-friendly mobile phases regardless of the detector that's attached to the application. Okay. Filter and degas, generally not necessary, and may introduce contaminants. I haven't filtered probably in about 20 years. LCMS grade solvents are filtered by the manufacturer, can be used as is. The laboratory water systems typically have a 0.2 micron filter at the point of use, although that laboratory that I visited last week did not. That was one reason why they had bacteria in their mobile phases. You can consider filtering solids containing crystalline modifiers. I've heard that, especially crystalline reagents in plastic bottles, there might be the possibility that small particles, microplastic particles, can get into the reagent and then wind up in the mobile phase and clog things. But I haven't found that to be the case. If you are filtering using 0.2 micron membrane, there's really no need to degas if you're using any modern LC. They all have membrane degassers built into them. So you don't really need to. For UHPLC, considering that your flow rates are in the 0.5 ml a minute, 0.6 ml a minute range, and your analytical runtimes are much shorter, you don't go through that much mobile phase. So only make enough for 1 or 2 days, 500 mils. Okay. I've started actually making 200 mils, just because. Which brings me to the next point, is since we're using volatile stuff in our mobile phase to promote ionization, well, volatile stuff goes away. So you need to set realistic expiration dates for LCMS mobile phases. So if you're a laboratory that's historically UV based, you might be in the habit of 1 month. The phosphate's not going anywhere. It's pH 3. I'm not worried about bacteria. But what's going to happen with formic acid, ammonia, it's going to be out of there pretty quickly. Ammonia is going to be out of there in a day. So if you're doing some negative ion work with ammonium hydroxide or ammonium formate, ammonium acetate, then you're probably making that mobile phase up every day. Okay? Avoid adding to partially filled bottles, especially the aqueous. If it's pure organic, sure, refill it, it's okay. bulk is aqueous, no, dump it, refill it. Okay? And be aware of mobile phases that support bacterial growth. Acetate, ammonium acetate, that is not pH adjusted is neutral, and that will grow bacteria pretty readily. As far as taking care of your LC, and what I like to call LC hygiene, don't idle your system in aqueous solvents. Okay? And when I say idle, I mean more than a few days. Okay? I'm not suggesting that as soon as you get finished your run, you have to flush out your system. No, you know. Overnight's okay. Over the weekend is okay. A week is probably okay. But yeah, if you're walking by your system that's idle, week 1, week 2, month 1, month 2, no. And it still has aqueous on there, you need to flush that out. Be mindful of the solvents on the system that don't get used that much, like the injector purge or the injector wash and the pump seal wash. And make sure that they have enough organic in there to prevent bacterial growth. Suitable mobile phase additives for MS. My go-to for positive ionization is formic acid. Like acetic acid's used, ammonium formate, ammonium acetate. I use those a lot for pellic work. Sometimes if I'm just want to do some quick and dirty neg iron work, I'll use ammonium hydroxide, but as I mentioned, that is so volatile that it's gone overnight. Ammonium bicarb. Trifluoroacetic acid is an ion suppressor. It's a negative ionization killer. So you're not going to see any neg ions if there's TFA in the mobile phase, or perhaps even traces of TFA in the mobile phase. But it's also a suppressor of positive ionization as well. However, it's such a wonderful ion pairing reagent for peptides that I'm not afraid to use it. Sometimes instead of the classic 0.1% TFA in water, some nitrile, I'll use 0.05%. Probably don't need, there's nothing magical about the 0.1. It's just the math to prepare it is easy, right? So you can use 0.05 and you probably get the same effect. Okay? And as far as the crystalline reagents, 10 to 50 millimolar, the higher the concentration, the more ion suppression you're going to get. Okay? Unsuitable additives, we talked about the classic non-volatile salts like phosphate and borate, the classic surfactants, sodium dodecyl sulfate, detergents, they will suppress ionization. I mean, the good news is columns are way better than they've ever been. There's more selections of columns, so you probably don't need to go down these classic ion pairing reagent scenarios. If you're looking at a method that's using one, take a look at the date of that method. It's probably really old. It's probably referencing like Waters' micro compact column, which was okay in its day, and we still make it. But we only make it for those people that are locked into a compendium method that can't change. Okay? No one is, if a new peer review article comes out using a micro compact, chances are that's from a university where some poor graduate student, that was the only column he had access to because they've been in control for 25 years. Inorganic acids like nitric, hydrochloric, phosphoric, and sulfuric, they're going to be corrosive to steel components. Really low concentrations of sulfuric and phosphoric might be okay, but other than that, you're going to be avoiding them. Okay, that is brings me to the conclusion of my talk. For additional stuff, rely on your vendor. That's what they're there for. That's It's what I made a fairly decent living at for the last 30 years. Hopefully, if this is your first time here to CCDG, hopefully you like what you heard and will come back. So be aware of the local discussion groups like CCDG, the Chicago Mass Spectrometry. The discussion group is also active in the area. American Chemical Society, the local section, has, they have talks, I think, pretty much every month. LCGC Magazine, Dwight Stoll is now the editor of the LC Troubleshooting column. I learned an incredible amount from reading that magazine. Back when I started, it was pretty common to get 3 or 4 trade journals on your desk every month, American Lab, LCGC, others. LCGC is the only one I read consistently. I pack it in my briefcase when I'm on a plane, I read on a plane. I still want to take a look at it. The best thing about that is that the topics in there are repeated often enough, so it reinforces. I haven't read many of Dwight's columns. John Dolan was fantastic at it, but Dwight's pretty good too. Okay. So that is all I have. All right, well, thanks everybody. Before